Welcome to the Needham Say More podcast. I guess this is season 4. Is that right, Doug?
I don't really know. There's been a big gap. I don't know. I think we leave them with a big cliffhanger last time?
I don't think so. All right. I'm Aaron Pressman.
And I am Doug Fox. Thanks so much for joining us.
We're trying something a little new today. We're doing both audio and video. We'll see how that comes out. But the topic today, which is going to be really important for Needham for a decade or more in the future, is the MBTA Communities Act, which the legislature passed and the governor signed in 2021. And the idea is to get a lot more multifamily housing in most cities and towns in Massachusetts that have those that have or are near any MBTA transportation.
And this is going to be the most significant changes to Needham zoning in decades. And we've debated a lot of kind of individual properties like Muzzy or the daycare on Central Ave or currently the medical building near Three Squares. And not enough people are talking about this at all. I mean, through the MBTA Communities Act, the town is required to zone to add 1,784 additional units of housing that we aren't currently zoned for, and it has to be.
Let's give a big picture. So basically, the law has this formula that says uh, takes into account takes into account a number of features of a town, like how much MBTA service do you have? Is it subway or commuter rail like Needham, or are you just adjacent? How big is the town and how much development does it already have? Factors like that. And you pump everything through this formula, and then you get that number, which Doug just gave, almost 1,800 new
Yeah,
multifamily units required under the law. Now, required by zoning,
by zoning.
as we've seen in, for example, the zoning for Muzzy Ford or other projects, just changing the zoning doesn't magically create all the projects.
Yeah, and there are lots of other towns that have to do this all at the same time, and there's so many developers and so much money, and actually, especially right now with interest rates as high as there are, if that's the case when all this comes through, it could be limited. But this is still significant zoning changes, which could have a huge impact. I mean, I think it should have a huge impact on the town. All of this needs to be within a half mile of one of our 4 train stations.
90%, 90% within a half mile.
90%. Um, and a minimum density of 3 units per lot. So that just naturally, if you look at what is in a half mile from our train stations, there's going to be things that are currently zoned single family that are going to have some other density of zoning naturally from this. And
So, yeah, go ahead.
the town has big decisions to make. There's a great committee that has been formed of a bunch of different citizens and leadership that are working hard on it, but they want lots of town input. They sent a postcard out to you that you may or may not have seen. It was not the most engaging postcard, but they're trying to get people to come to meetings, that they're going to have a very engaging meeting to get input. And this is going to
Housing Needham Advisory Group, which they're using the acronym HONE.
yeah.
And HONE includes members of the planning board, the select board, the finance committee, and then a few other sort of an
An
architect.
attorney, a developer, a renter, and then one at large, plus some other committees and,
And
town leadership.
they're guiding this process, but ultimately it will be up to town meeting, which is the sole authority that can change the town zoning law. So basically, I think Hone's idea is to help shape a proposal that will meet the law's requirements. They have some consultants already who are kind of working on different models, and then ultimately it would have to come before town meeting. As far as I know, only one town so far. We still have like a year and a half before we have to finish this under the law. One town, Lexington, has completed its new zoning proposals to add housing.
Some towns had an earlier deadline. Some towns did have a deadline, I believe, of December of this year, where we are not required to have it passed until December of next year. So December 31st, we need to be approved and in compliance. Otherwise, we face the penalties that have been listed and threatened or whatever that would be.
That's right. I think we should give one caveat, which is like whenever we're talking about zoning law, there's immense detail and complexity in all this. So please, please fact check all the numbers that we talk about today. But one thing I wanted to put out there for you is that Needham already has a zoning designation, a type of zoning called apartment one zoning. And there are not a lot of places, but a few places around town that are zoned as apartment one. And those can have up to 18 units per acre. They can be up to 3 stories high, and they're required to have 1.5 parking spaces per unit. That's the typical zoning. Under the MBTA law, it's not exactly the exact match. The MBTA law requires multifamily housing of at least 15 units per acre that are within 90% within a half a mile of transit. No, importantly, no age restrictions can be on the housing. So it has to be housing that maybe families with kids might be willing to take. Then there's these other places where the law is trying to stop the way towns have in the past kind of discriminated against or disincentivized multifamily housing. So one is no more than 10% of the project can be affordable. And the reason is because as you raise the affordability requirement, you make it harder and harder for developers to economically produce a project. So it sounds nice to say 25% of a project should be affordable, but that makes it very difficult for any projects to actually be built. So under the Communities Act, only 10% or less can be required as affordable. And similarly, although Doug and I were sort of trying to figure it out exactly, there are some restrictions on minimum parking. The law has like maximum parking on a scale that varies depending on how close it is to the MBTA stations. So these kind of things like parking requirements, affordability requirements, age restrictions are ways that in the past towns have said like, oh, we allow multifamily, we allow apartments, but in practice makes it very hard for developers.
And the apartment building, for those who remember, it might be 10 years ago, it might be longer, but that went in where the old theater was. It's right next to the Latina restaurant. That was a long, arduous process for that developer, specifically about the number of spaces
Parking
that they were going to
spaces.
have available. And we're going through a similar thing, I think, right now with the people that want to develop Hillcrest Gardens, is also dealing with a lot of the same of what sort of traffic is going to come out of it, and are there enough parking spots that are part of it. And it kind of draws it out, and it does make developers not necessarily enthusiastic about going through that process, where this is zoning as a right. So it theoretically, if you follow the rules of the zoning, it should be a very streamlined process to get approval in Needham or in any of the communities that pass this zoning.
As I understand it, one kind of controversial part of this law, especially for towns that are even more developed than Needham, like Brookline, was whether you could require sort of multifunctional buildings where the first story would be retail and the upper stories would be housing. And I think ultimately the state has agreed that in certain areas you can require to kind of keep the character, keep that retail lively street scene available. You can have requirements where there can be retail on the bottom and multifamily above. But
Yeah,
initially, the law was seen to require to sort of ban that again as a way to like just make it easier and simpler for just housing.
and that made the housing committee afraid before that, whether it's an amendment or whatever adjustment was passed, to include the center district in the MBTA Communities Act, because theoretically we could lose a bunch of the stores. Someone could wreck a whole store district and build an apartment building. Where
Yeah,
I think we, yeah.
so one place to start thinking about it for Needham is so most of this new zoning, most of this new housing zoning has to be allowed within a half a mile of a transit station. So we have the 4 commuter rail stations, the one at Hersey, Needham Junction, which is very near me, Needham Center, which is near you, Doug, and then Needham Heights. And I think already what the Hone has focused on the fact is that maybe Hersey is a very residential area, and so that's probably not the best place for these
And you have the
new.
golf course on one side of it where it wouldn't be able to be included in it. So it would need to push, right? Even the half mile from there. I believe that is the case, but still there's going to be these public hearings. So if for some reason the public wanted to argue against that, I think it makes a lot of sense to exclude Hersey and focus on the other three.
Yeah, so the focus so far has been on the other 3, and we have a consultant, and then they have these like very complicated computer programs that kind of model all the zoning that we already have, and then start looking at places where maybe you could start fitting in these zones. And so at a recent meeting of Hone, they have sort of very preliminary ideas about like, well, maybe you could put it here, maybe you could put it there, maybe you could put it there. And one thing that I think was my take, even though these are not anywhere near final and they haven't been decided upon, they're just sort of like fitting, seeing where things will fit. One thing that struck me was that some of the zoning that we've done in town meeting in the past has been large, huge stretches, like all along Chestnut Street, the whole business corridor, from the junction all the way through the center. And it seems like the approach that they're favoring right now is much smaller, more targeted areas. So, just like a few blocks over here or 10 acres over there and those kind of things, as opposed to like a vast area of the center that could be allowed for multifamily housing.
But it does need to be contiguous land is one of the like there's a minimum size, right? A minimal land area of 50 acres, and it needs to be contiguous. And they gave some examples of what contiguous meant, that you could jump over a street, but you couldn't have like a block excluded. It jumps over a block is not contiguous. So there is, to be compliant, the slicing and dicing can only go so far.
And then there's like all kinds. So we're nowhere near actually choosing the specific places. That's why they're having these public hearings to kind of get an idea about it. It was even mentioned at the most recent Hone meeting that they were a little worried if they made the maps that people would think they were proposing those things, and then all of people's reactions would be focused on don't put it here, don't put it there. When we're not even at that stage, they're really trying. At this stage, they're trying to gather sort of people's general ideas about height limitations and
Yeah.
general areas where these things might be.
Yeah, and they talk about these four levers, and they have these visualizations. They're trying to simplify it to, for people that are not real estate people to be able to understand. But basically, the four levers are lot size, lot coverage or FAR, floor area ratio, height, and units per acre. And if you just think of it, right, do we want to go high and dense in a smaller area, or do we want to go out further and with less density? I know that's kind of like a high level, but that is the discussion. Do we want to go out really far where there's 3 and 4 units per lot, or do we want to have certain areas, like more dense areas, where maybe it goes up multiple stories and there are multiple units and more buildings? And this is a discussion. This is a discussion that people are going to have different opinions on, and it's going to very much shape the future of Needham, what we choose here. So, I really hope that these meetings are very well attended and people get engaged. And if they can't attend the meetings, they're educating themselves and they're expressing their opinion, because the town very much does want opinions on this. Like, they're spending money to try to communicate and make people aware, to get input. So this is going to be, a public input led process on what Needham really wants to do with this MBTA Communities Act.
I do think so the consultants have produced a lot of work already, and we'll put a link in the show notes, as we say, to the consultants report that was presented to Honey. But one thing is, in an appendix to that report, it's Appendix 7.4, MBTA District Concept Map of MBTA Station Neighborhoods. There are a vast number of possible suggestions of places that could be zoned for these multifamily, at least 15 units per acre places. Some of them are sort of not surprising, like the old Hartney Graymont spot under the railroad tracks is listed on there. The old where is that one? Oh, the Brookline Rug parcel, which is actually right near Honeywell Street and kind of some other current apartment zoning areas. So that's like a place that seems obvious. There is this one weird section that Doug and I spent like 20 minutes trying to research before the podcast, which is about temples, churches, and houses of worship. This does propose sort of adding zoning that would allow multifamily housing to a place like Congregational Church on Great Plain Avenue, Temple Beth Shalom at Webster Street and Highland Avenue. And then it goes on to say, like, well, it doesn't seem like those could be developed, but maybe that down the line they could be developed. And to me, that's almost like but let me say this carefully. That's a pretty tricky way, I think, to meet the requirements of the law, because it seems like most of those institutions are going to be there for a long, long time. And while we could technically change the zoning, that seems exactly sort of like the old days when we used other kinds of restrictions or like parking requirements to kind of thwart the actual viability of those projects.
Yeah, and the state does have a list of what's considered excluded land. I don't know if churches and temples are part of it, but
Libraries,
obvious,
waterways, a couple
yeah,
things.
no, and institutional land, which is more town buildings, like the library was one of the things. Like the library could be in one of the zones. That gets excluded, obviously, because that's not something that someone could develop. Um, but my sense is that the town representatives on the committee is they don't want to do this just to check a box. They do want to do something that will hopefully lead to housing production in Needham in places where the town agrees to it and wants it within the realms of this act. And I mean, I think it is worth talking about why the act was passed is the housing shortage we have in this area and the housing shortage that we absolutely have in Needham. They've presented these numbers that from 1990 to 2020, Needham produced half as many housing units as it creates in the 30 years before, from 60 to 90. Yet population is growing and more people are coming here to go into school, and a lot of them want to stay. The median single family home price is currently 1.325 million in July of this year, which based on current interest rates requires an income of 353,000 per year. And just put it in perspective, the current Needham median income is 182,813, which gives, they refer to as an affordability gap of 693,000, because if your income is 182,000, you currently could only afford a house of 693,000. So big gap, even bigger if we look at medium income in Greater Boston, right, which is lower. And that is talking about buying. When it even comes to renters, um, no better example of the desire for affordable rental units was that new development at 1180 Great Plain Ave, which is right next to the Congregational Church, has 4 affordable units in it, and they open it up to applications. They had 480 applications for that. 153 were from Needham residents and workers. So that shows the amount of demand for affordable rents. And if you look at our aging population in our town, I know there are more seniors that are looking to downsize and accessible apartments. This could possibly lead to that and creating more opportunity. So there is a need, a huge need. And, I think I believe that as a town, we want to do the right thing and want to do the zoning that will lead to some more housing, not necessarily affordable, but more housing. I think with all the towns doing it, as they add more housing, hopefully that with supply and demand will lower costs slightly. But I think the town does want to do the right thing and not just check a box and not just cram this all into, like, on the other side of the railroad tracks or whatever kind of that a lot of people want to do with denser housing.
I think that's a great point. It's that, teachers and firefighters and police or just, kids of town residents who
Our
didn't buy
kids.
houses here in the 50s, who want to stay here, have a really hard time. You can just look down South Street and see these giant $4 million houses for sale and going in and stuff. And that's what the town housing stock is going towards, unless we can sort of hopefully incentivize some developers to build something else.
Yeah, and yes, it matters to Needham, but it matters to the whole area. I mean, we're going to have a hard time holding on to people, right? We lose our competitiveness as a region, if people can move and get a job and get the lifestyle they want at a lower cost of living, So this matters. I've even heard that people will get a job and they don't want to move here because there's not a lot available for them to buy or rent and what it costs, and that's a problem. The Chamber of Commerce presented a lot of stuff on that companies are having a hard time recruiting people to move to our area.
Yeah, the Globe is doing a series about this. I think they focused first on Milton, but one of the things in there was that the former governor said that when Amazon was looking for where to put its HQ2, the real problem for the Boston area was the housing market and how unaffordable it was, and there was no way to hide that or get around that. And so I think that's part of what motivated Charlie Baker to sign the law and the legislature to pass the law. So hopefully it can make a big difference. It's going to be a process and maybe a fight in some quarters to get all the zoning rules passed, and to have it is important that we pick viable places where it makes sense to build
Yeah.
multifamily houses and apartment buildings because we want the development. We don't want to just check the box.
And there are some towns that are fighting this. I know Milton was an example of a town that was fighting what the state said they had to allocate, and I
They
believe they
they
lost.
recently lost. They tried to appeal like how much MBTA service they had, and they lost that appeal. There is one town outside Worcester, I think it's Holden, that is saying like they don't want to do this at all. They're not going to do it, and a housing group is suing them. So we'll see, how far they can resist. But it seems like so far of the 177 towns covered, 176 at least are following the procedures and trying to get it done.
Yeah, but ultimately, as Aaron said earlier, this is going to be a vote at town meeting. And zoning, right? Is this 2/3 or did that change to half? Do you know?
Changed, changed
So
to half.
just a majority, half. I like to think that the town meeting is going to pass it, but there will be some towns where it may not pass. And just Needham is hoping to be able to vote on this in our spring town meeting. There are obviously a lot of things that need to line up to make that happen. If that doesn't happen, it could theoretically bump to the fall in the special town meeting. I know we normally don't like to vote on zoning during the special town meeting, but could be a unique circumstance. And once again, we need to be in compliance by end of December next year of 2024, or we will face a bunch of penalties.
Yeah, we would be facing down the deadline in the law. So I think it would be hard to object to doing it in October if that was the last deadline. In Lexington, for example, the vote only 60% but 60% of town meeting approved it. So that approved it under the current rules, but under the old rules where zoning changes required a 2/3 majority, that would not have passed. The debate there, I think one of the controversial issues was about the height restrictions and how many stories they would allow in these new districts. And I'm sure that's something we'll have to debate over as well. You might remember that when a change was proposed for the Hartney Graymont lot, I think it was 5 or 6 stories. It was too tall, and town meeting did not go for it.
Yeah, it was one particular property. It was large. I mean, there was a lot of discussions of that. Um, I want to bring up where you said that we don't want to get down to the deadline. Needham has gotten back up against the deadline before. I forget there was something we were voting on having to do about like water coming off roofs of properties and stuff. Remember, there was a federal law. We were going to face these big penalties, and we literally got to the last meeting where we could approve it. And town leadership at the time proposed basically passing something that was blank. And the town attorney, when asked, did not recommend that. So I think we're doing the right thing to do this in advance to pass it, and I really do believe this is the right thing to do. But what my opinion is on what is right does not mean it's the opinion on what other people's is right. So I really hope we fill that room. The first meeting is coming up on November 9th. There's going to be a short presentation and then like an hour-long interactive session. We're going to break into groups, and people are going to be able to kind of move levers around maps and stuff and say what they want. And we're going to have another one in January and March. So everyone, please put November 9th on your calendar to show up, listen, and give your point of view.
And we really don't want to hear that. Where is this coming from? We never heard about this. We didn't have enough notice, which sometimes happens at town meeting. Residents show up and give those complaints, but there's postcards going out. Doug, do you have your postcard?
I have my postcard. I'm fairly certain that if most people open their mail over a trash can like I do, that they may not have ever seen it because it didn't really grab anyone's attention. But this is
Well,
hard, right?
right. I think
So
all the bodies in town are talking about it. It's in all the media in town that we have now, and this podcast.
yeah, yeah, and we're doing. Aaron and I are doing our part to help you be aware, and we'll continue to do that on social media leading up to these. But it's a great topic and an important thing that's going to shape the future of the town. So I hope you play a role.
So I think that's it for this week for the Needham Say More podcast. I'm Aaron Pressman.
And I'm Doug Fox. Thanks so much for joining us.